He moved in on a Wednesday, in the quiet hours between late afternoon and evening, when the streets had already begun to empty, and the pale orange sky cast long, stretched shadows over the concrete staircases and peeling facades of the building that would now be his. The apartment was small and mostly empty, as expected from the classified ad he barely trusted, but something about its silence felt heavier than it should have, not the kind that came from an absence of noise, but the type that suggested sound had once lived here and now refused to return. The walls smelled faintly of old paint and something else, something metallic, perhaps rust, perhaps dust, though he couldn't quite place it. There was only one mirror in the apartment, built into the far end of the hallway, full-length and slightly warped from age, with a wooden frame painted white at some point in the past, now yellowed and chipped. It didn't bother him at first, he barely noticed it on the first night as he shuffled boxes and dragged his mattress across the floor, but sometime around the third evening, when he was brushing his teeth in the half-darkness and walked past the hallway, something in the reflection caught his attention. It wasn't movement exactly, more like a wrongness in shape, a sense that something stood where nothing should have stood, barely a flicker at the edge of the glass. He stopped and looked again, but saw only the hallway, dim and empty, stretching quietly toward the kitchen. He turned around, scanned the space behind him, flicked on the kitchen light, then back off, and told himself it was the exhaustion playing tricks, the kind of visual noise that creeps into your mind when you're adjusting to unfamiliar walls and strange proportions. Still, that night, he placed a chair across from the mirror without knowing why, and went to bed with the distinct impression that the mirror had held on to something just a moment too long. The days passed, quiet and uneventful. He unpacked his books, set up his laptop, bought cheap curtains from the store down the street, and tried to settle into the pattern of living alone in a place that didn't seem entirely his. But the mirror began to pull at his attention in subtle, persistent ways. Every time he walked past it, there was a pause, a hesitation in his movement, as if he expected to see something waiting for him in the glass. And sometimes, he did. At first, it was vague, a tall shape, barely distinguishable from the shadows behind it, like a coat rack or a trick of the light, but it didn't move, and it didn't reflect anything that should have been there. The hallway was always empty when he turned to check. He tried rationalizing it as misaligned lighting, distortion from the old glass, or simply his own overactive mind adjusting to solitude, but no matter how he rearranged the hallway or adjusted the nearby lights, the silhouette kept appearing, always faint, always still, always just far enough away to be uncertain. It never appeared during the day. The mirror showed only what it was supposed to, the walls, the doorway to the kitchen, the edge of the living room. But as soon as evening fell and the apartment sank into quietness, the figure returned, standing motionless at the far end of the hall in the reflection, tall, dark, and utterly silent. It didn't seem to be facing him, or perhaps it was, but it had no discernible face, just a void of featureless shadow where a person's head should be. He began keeping the hallway lights on through the night, hoping the brightness would somehow erase the figure's presence, but it didn't help, the silhouette remained in the mirror, perfectly still. One night, he gathered the courage to walk slowly toward the mirror while watching the reflection. The figure stood unmoving, but as he approached, a wave of unease washed over him so intensely that his knees weakened, and he stopped just a few feet from the glass. His own reflection was there, pale and tense, but behind him, in the reflection, not in the hallway, the silhouette stood closer than it had before. He spun around, heart racing, but the hallway behind him was empty, quiet as ever. He stared at the nothingness for several long seconds before turning back to the mirror, and the figure was gone. After that, he started covering the mirror at night with a bedsheet, but even then, he sometimes sensed it, not visually, but with a feeling deep in his chest, a pressure, as if something stood just behind the fabric, watching through the cotton weave. Sometimes he'd wake up to find the sheet on the floor, crumpled beneath the mirror like it had been pulled off. He told himself it had slipped, but the pins he used to fix it in place still hung on the wall, untouched. Then, there was the night he found himself standing in front of the mirror without remembering how he got there. It was 3:12 a.m. He was barefoot, half awake, staring into the glass as if waiting for something to speak. His own reflection stared back, and behind it, the figure stood inches away, closer than it had ever been. When he blinked, it was gone. He stumbled backward and didn't sleep the rest of the night. From that point forward, things shifted. He began noticing subtle changes in his apartment, drawers slightly open when he hadn't used them, chairs moved a few inches to the side, the bedroom door left ajar when he was certain he had closed it. The changes were small, but undeniable, like the residue of someone else's presence, someone who did not want to be seen, someone who moved only when he wasn't looking. And always, when he passed the mirror, the figure was there. Getting closer. He stopped looking into the mirror altogether, not out of choice or cowardice, but because at some point, the act itself began to feel wrong, not frightening in the way nightmares frighten a child, but instinctively wrong, like placing your hand in water and feeling something pulse back against your skin, like seeing your own shadow hesitate while you move forward. He still passed the hallway daily, of course, the layout of the apartment didn't allow for avoidance, but his gaze remained fixed on the floor, on the walls, on the doorframe, anywhere but the mirror, which now seemed to occupy not just space, but attention, atmosphere, a quiet gravitational pull that weighed heavier with each passing evening. And yet, despite his refusal to meet it directly, the mirror made itself known. He began seeing it in places where it wasn't, flashes of reflective glass in the corners of his eyes, glimpses of movement in television screens turned off, in the stainless steel of the sink faucet, in the black void of his phone screen when it dimmed. The silhouette, or something like it, had started leaking beyond its designated space, following him subtly, silently, never revealing its full shape but always implied, always present in the way darkness pulled in corners just a little too thick, or the way his own reflection seemed slightly delayed, slightly misaligned, slightly other. Sleep began to fail him. Not in the dramatic, cinematic sense of insomnia, but in a quieter, more corrosive way. He would close his eyes and wake up standing in another room, or sitting upright in bed with no recollection of how much time had passed. Sometimes, the apartment would feel wrong, not in its structure, but in its sensation, as if the floor were made of slightly different material, or the air carried a faint hum that hadn't been there before. The silence, once benign, grew unbearable. It was no longer the absence of noise, but the thick, oppressive anticipation of sound that never came, like a room inhaling but never exhaling. He began locking his bedroom door, not because it made him feel safe, but because some distant, animal part of him believed that placing even a single barrier between himself and the hallway might delay whatever it was that stood behind the glass. He kept the lights on at all hours, and the blinds closed tight, and even began sleeping with music on, low, repetitive, ambient loops that filled the void just enough to feel less alone. But none of it helped. The figure was still there. He could feel it.